September the 1st, 1939. Dawn broke cold and grey over the Polish village of Mokra, 5 kilometres north of Kłobuk. The mist hung heavy in the valleys between the wooded hills, and the silence that had lasted for years was about to be shattered forever. In defensive positions carefully prepared over the preceding days, Polish soldiers of the Wawinska Cavalry Brigade waited, their fingers cold on the metal of their weapons. Among them, crews manned 37mm Bofors anti-tank guns, Swedish-designed weapons that Poland had purchased and license-produced by the hundreds. These gunners had trained for months on these weapons, but today would be their first time firing at an enemy in anger. None of them knew they were about to participate in one of the most significant engagements of the opening day of World War II, a battle that would shatter German assumptions about their new tanks and validate Polish defensive planning in the most brutal way possible. 23 miles to the west, German tankers of the 4th Panzer Division were climbing into their machines as the pre-dawn darkness began to fade. Most of these men crewed Panzerkampfwagen II tanks, the backbone of Germany's armoured force in 1939. The Panzer II represented Germany's attempt to field a real combat tank, while their more powerful Panzer III and IV models were still in development. Armed with a 20mm autocannon and a machine gun, protected by armour ranging from 14.5mm on the turret to 30mm on the front hull of later models, and crewed by 3 men, the Panzer II weighed 10 tons and could reach speeds of 40 km per hour. German commanders considered it adequate for the Polish campaign. The Wehrmacht had deployed over 1,000 Panzer IIs for the invasion, making it the single most numerous tank in the German arsenal. German tankers had been told the Polish army was obsolete, equipped with cavalry and outdated equipment, unprepared for modern mechanized warfare. They expected a quick victory. Within hours, that confidence would be tested against the reality of Polish anti-tank capabilities. The German 4th Panzer Division, commanded by General Georg Hans Reinhardt, was part of Army Group South under General Gerd von Rundstedt. Their mission was straightforward: break through Polish defences and drive deep into the interior, enabling the encirclement of Polish forces. The division's route took them directly toward Mokra and the positions of Colonel Julian Filipowicz's cavalry brigade. This was to be the first major test of Germany's panzer divisions against a prepared enemy. At 6:30 in the morning, German motorcycle reconnaissance units made first contact with Polish positions near the village. The Polish 84th Infantry Regiment's 12th Company, commanded by Stanisław Radajewicz, opened fire. Within minutes, German armour arrived, supported by infantry. The morning battle had begun. German commanders, observing from command vehicles, initially felt confident. They had tanks, the Poles had horses. This was going to be a massacre. But as the first waves of Panzer IIs advanced toward Polish positions, something unexpected happened. The German tanks began to explode, at ranges of 400 metres, then 300, then at point-blank range of 150 metres. Polish 37mm anti-tank guns opened fire with devastating effect. The Bofors WZ-36, as the Poles designated their licensed version of the Swedish design, was one of the best anti-tank weapons in the world in 1939. Developed by the Swedish arms manufacturer Bofors in the early 1930s, the gun could fire a 740-gram armour-piercing projectile at 830 metres per second. At typical combat ranges, it could penetrate 40mm of armour. Against the Panzer II's protection, which ranged from 14.5 to 30mm, the Bofors was absolutely lethal. The Polish army had deployed 1,200 of these guns, with 27 assigned to each infantry division and 14 to each cavalry brigade. The Wawinska Cavalry Brigade at Mokra had its full complement of anti-tank weapons, and the crews had positioned them perfectly. The mathematics of the engagement were brutally simple. The Panzer II's frontal armour on early models was just 14.5mm on the turret and 14mm on the upper front hull. Later Ausf-C models that made up the bulk of the force had improved this to 30mm on the front hull, but the turret remained at 14.5mm. The Bofors gun could penetrate 20mm of armour at 1,000 metres, 40mm at 300 metres, when hitting at a 60-degree angle. At the ranges, the battle at Mokra was fought. Polish anti-tank gunners could defeat any part of the Panzer II's armour with confidence. The German 20mm autocannon mounted in the Panzer II turret, by contrast, was designed primarily for use against soft targets and light vehicles. Its armour-piercing ammunition could penetrate 23mm of armour at 100 metres, enough to defeat Polish tankettes and some armoured cars, but the weapon had never been intended for tank versus tank combat. The Panzer II was designed as a stopgap measure, a training tank pressed into combat service, because Germany's more capable Panzer III and IV models weren't available in sufficient numbers. What happened next at Mokra shocked German commanders. As Polish anti-tank guns opened fire at 150 metres, 2 Panzer IIs were destroyed within seconds. The German tank column, which had been advancing in formation toward the village, suddenly stopped. Commanders attempted to manoeuvre, pulling back to 400 metres and trying to use their guns and artillery to suppress the Polish positions, but the Bofors crews were well trained and their positions were expertly camouflaged. When the Germans tried to advance again, they lost 2 more armoured fighting vehicles, one destroyed completely and another immobilised. The German attack broke. Tanks retreated, leaving their supporting infantry exposed on open ground in front of Polish positions. Polish cavalry, fighting dismounted with rifles and machine guns as they had trained to do, counterattacked. German infantry, who had expected to follow tanks through broken Polish lines, instead found themselves pinned down under fire, taking heavy casualties. This wasn't supposed to happen. Tanks were supposed to be invulnerable to anything except other tanks. But here at Mokra, Polish anti-tank guns were destroying German armour with ease. The engagement at Mokra was not an isolated incident. Throughout the first day of the invasion, German tank units encountered Polish anti-tank weapons that proved far more effective than intelligence had predicted. The Polish army had not just deployed 1,237mm Bofors guns, they had also issued 92 anti-tank rifles to each infantry and cavalry division. The WZ-35 anti-tank rifle, a remarkable Polish design, fired a 7.92mm tungsten core projectile at a velocity of 4,000 feet per second. It could penetrate 15mm of armour at 300 metres at a 30-degree angle, or 33mm at 100 metres. Against the Panzer II's side and rear armour, which was just 14mm thick, the anti-tank rifle was devastatingly effective. Polish infantry discovered they could engage German tanks at ranges where the Panzer II's 20mm cannon was ineffective, destroying or immobilising vehicles before the Germans could return effective fire. By mid-morning at Mokra, the battle had developed into a chaotic melee. German forces, frustrated by their inability to break through Polish anti-tank defences, called in the Luftwaffe. Junkers, Ju-87, Stuka dive bombers made repeated attacks on Polish positions. By the end of the day, German aircraft would fly 15 sorties, with 9 to 26 bombers in each attack. But the bombing proved less effective than hoped. Polish cavalry had dispersed their forces and camouflaged their positions well. While the Luftwaffe killed many horses and destroyed some ammunition wagons, they largely missed the defensive positions themselves. The anti-tank guns remained operational. At 10 in the morning, approximately 100 German tanks returned to attack the village of Mokra directly. This time, German commanders had learned from the morning's disasters. Rather than advancing in the open, they attempted to use the village itself as cover, driving their tanks into the built-up area where Polish anti-tank guns would have difficulty engaging at long range. The assault broke the defensive line of the 21st Ulan Regiments, 4th Squadron. German tanks pushed into the central part of the village, destroying 2 Polish anti-tank guns in close combat and setting houses on fire. For a moment it appeared the German attack might succeed, but Colonel Filipowicz had reserves. The Polish 19th Regiment attempted to withdraw across a railway line, only to find German tanks already blocking their escape route. The regiment was effectively surrounded, caught between the tanks in the village and other German forces manoeuvring to envelope the Polish positions. What happened next would become legendary. Polish armoured train number 53, named Śmiały, which translates as bold, arrived on the battlefield just as German tanks were crossing the railway line. The train, armed with 2 75mm guns and heavy machine guns, stopped directly in the middle of the German tank column. At point-blank range, the train opened fire. The carnage was immediate. 75mm high explosive shells detonated against thin armour plate. Panzer I's and Panzer II's, caught in the confined space of the railway crossing with nowhere to manoeuvre, were destroyed or disabled within seconds. The German column dispersed in chaos, retreating with heavy losses while the 19th Regiment escaped across the railway under cover of the armoured train's guns. This was not the quick victory German planners had anticipated. The 4th Panzer Division, one of Germany's premier armoured formations, had been stopped cold by a Polish cavalry brigade. The division reported losing more than 50 tanks destroyed or disabled on September 1st. When Italian war correspondents toured other battlefields after the initial engagements, they found scenes of devastation. Destroyed Panzer IIs littered the approaches to Polish defensive positions, their thin armour penetrated by 37mm armour-piercing shot, their crews dead inside or burned beyond recognition. The shock of these first encounters rippled through German command. Staff officers, who had expected Polish forces to collapse immediately instead, found themselves dealing with an enemy that not only understood modern anti-tank warfare, but had equipped and trained specifically to defeat German armour. General Heinz Guderian, commander of the 19th Corps, later wrote about encountering Polish cavalry, claiming in his memoirs that they had charged tanks with swords and lances in ignorance of modern warfare. This was propaganda, either deliberate or based on misunderstanding. The reality, documented in after-action reports and photographs, was that Polish cavalry fought as mobile mounted infantry, using horses for transportation and fighting dismounted with modern weapons including anti-tank guns and rifles. When Polish cavalry did charge at Krojanty on September 1st, they attacked German infantry, not tanks, and were forced to retreat only when German armoured cars appeared unexpectedly from a nearby forest road. The myth of Polish cavalry charging tanks with lances became one of the enduring propaganda victories of the war, repeated endlessly to mock Polish military competence. The truth was far different and far more dangerous for the Germans. The Panzer II's vulnerability to Polish anti-tank weapons forced German tactical adaptations within days of the invasion's start. Tank commanders learned to avoid frontal attacks against prepared positions. They began using supporting infantry to scout for anti-tank guns before committing armour. They called for more artillery and air support to suppress Polish defences before advancing. These were the correct tactical responses, but they slowed the German advance and increased casualties. The vaunted Blitzkrieg, which was supposed to paralyse Poland through speed and shock, instead bogged down in bloody combat against defenders who refused to break. In total, during the 36-day Polish campaign, Germany lost 819 tanks, of which 236 were completely destroyed beyond repair. An additional 593 tanks were damaged or disabled. Considering that Germany had deployed approximately 2,500 tanks for the invasion, this represented losses of over 30% of the total force. These were staggering casualties for what was supposed to be an easy victory against an obsolete enemy. Polish anti-tank gunners were not the only threat. Polish tanks, though fewer in number, also proved dangerous. The 70p light tank, Poland's domestically produced design, mounted the same 37mm Bofors gun used in the towed anti-tank role. The 132 70p tanks in Polish service could destroy any German tank at typical combat ranges. At the Battle of Pultusk, Polish forces captured a significant number of German tanks, demonstrating that when Polish armour and anti-tank units had adequate support, they could not just stop but defeat German attacks. The problem for Poland was not the quality of their equipment or the training of their soldiers. It was numbers, deployment, and strategic situation. Poland had mobilised only partially when Germany invaded. Forces were spread thin, trying to defend the entire border. German forces attacking from three sides, from Germany, East Prussia, and Slovakia, could concentrate overwhelming force at points of attack. When the Soviet Union invaded from the east on September 17th, Polish strategic position became hopeless. But at the tactical level, in battles like Mokra, Polish forces proved they could fight effectively against German armour. The German army's experience in Poland forced immediate reconsideration of tank design and doctrine. After-action reports made clear that 14 to 30mm of armour was insufficient against modern anti-tank weapons. Even the 37mm guns, which were relatively small calibre by later war standards, could defeat Panzer II protection easily. German designers began work on up-armoured versions of existing tanks and accelerated development of the Panzer III and IV models, which featured thicker armour and more powerful guns. The Panzer II AEUSFF variant, which entered production in 1940, featured 35mm of frontal armour, a significant increase over earlier models. But even this was recognised as inadequate for anything except reconnaissance. The experiences at Mokra and other Polish battlefields demonstrated that the era of lightly armoured tanks was ending. Future armoured vehicles would need much thicker protection to survive against even relatively small anti-tank weapons. For the Polish gunners who fought at Mokra and dozens of other engagements during September 1939, the memory of those first days remained vivid for the rest of their lives. They had been told German armour was invincible. They had been warned that the Wehrmacht represented a new kind of warfare against which traditional defences would be useless. But when German tanks appeared in their sights, when they pulled the triggers on their Bofors guns and saw 37mm armour-piercing shells punch through thin steel plate and detonate inside cramped crew compartments, they learned that the invincible tanks could be destroyed. Each successful engagement proved that German armour was vulnerable, that proper weapons and training could defeat even the most modern mechanised forces. The problem was that Poland couldn't win individual battles fast enough. For every German tank destroyed, 10 more appeared. For every Polish defensive position that held, 3 others were overrun. The strategic mathematics were brutal and inevitable. The German tank crews who survived the Polish campaign came away with a profound respect for anti-tank weapons. Panzer II crews in particular, who knew their vehicles were thinly armoured, learned to fear the distinctive crack of 37mm guns, the sound of a high-velocity armour-piercing round hitting steel, the shower of spalling fragments inside the crew compartment if the armour was penetrated, the flash of fire if the fuel tank or ammunition was hit. These became the stuff of nightmares. Tank crews began demanding better armour, better guns, better supporting infantry to protect them from anti-tank weapons. The legend of the unstoppable Panzer Division had been badly damaged on Polish battlefields. German propaganda worked overtime to maintain the myth of easy victory, but the soldiers who had fought knew better. Poland had cost them dearly. By the time Warsaw surrendered on September 27th, the strategic lessons were being incorporated into German planning. The Panzer II would continue in service for the invasions of France and the Low Countries in 1940, and the initial stages of Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941. But it would increasingly be relegated to reconnaissance roles or used for training. Combat experience had proved what designers had known from the beginning. The Panzer II was never meant to be a true battle tank. It was a stopgap, a placeholder until better vehicles could be produced. The 37mm Bofors guns that destroyed so many Panzer IIs in Poland would themselves become obsolete within 2 years as tank armour thickness increased. But in September 1939, they were more than adequate for the task. Polish defensive planning had been sound. The weapons worked, the training worked, the tactics worked. What failed was the strategic situation, the overwhelming German numerical superiority and the Soviet invasion from the east that made continued resistance impossible. General Gerd von Rundstedt, commander of German Army Group South during the Polish invasion, later acknowledged the effectiveness of Polish resistance. In post-war statements he noted that Polish cavalry attacked heroically, and that in general the bravery and heroism of the Polish army merited great respect. This was an unusual admission from a senior German officer, most of whom preferred to maintain the fiction that the Polish campaign had been an easy demonstration of German military superiority. The reality, visible in casualty reports and after-action analyses, was that Poland had been a far tougher opponent than anticipated. If France and Britain had launched the offensive in the west they had promised, if Polish mobilization had been completed before the invasion began, the outcome might have been very different. But history doesn't reward might-have-beens. For the Polish soldiers who manned anti-tank guns at Mokra and countless other battlefields during September 1939, the outcome was bitter. They had done everything asked of them. They had destroyed German tanks, stopped German attacks, inflicted casualties far beyond what the enemy expected. But it wasn't enough. When Poland fell, many of these men escaped to continue the fight, joining Polish forces in exile that would serve with distinction in North Africa, Italy and Western Europe. Others remained to fight in the underground resistance. Some survived the war, many didn't. But they had proven, in those desperate first days of September 1939, that German armour was not invincible, that proper weapons and brave men could stop the panzers. That knowledge would serve the Allies well in the years to come. Every lesson learned at Mokra, every after-action report from Polish anti-tank gunners, every photograph of destroyed Panzer IIs, contributed to the eventual defeat of Nazi Germany. The Battle of Mokra specifically remained in German military consciousness throughout the war. Staff officers studying the engagement noted multiple failures that needed correction. Tank infantry coordination had been poor. Reconnaissance had failed to identify Polish anti-tank gun positions. Artillery support had been inadequate. Air support, while impressive in scale, had not suppressed the defenders effectively. The Germans learned from these mistakes, improving their combined arms tactics for future campaigns. But they also learned that even improved tactics couldn't eliminate the fundamental vulnerability of thinly armoured vehicles to anti-tank weapons. The Panzer II's combat career effectively ended not in 1942 when production ceased, but in September 1939 on Polish battlefields where 37mm guns proved it was obsolete for frontline combat. The Polish 37mm Bofors gun continued to see service long after Poland fell. The Germans captured over 1,100 of these weapons during their occupation and pressed them into service as the 3.7cm Pat 36P. They used these guns in France, North Africa, and on the Eastern Front. Romania purchased 556 former Polish guns from Germany and used them extensively in combat. Finland acquired Polish-made examples from Germany and also purchased production licenses from Sweden, manufacturing 355 guns that remained in Finnish service until 1986. The British purchased Bofors guns that were used by long-range desert group units in North Africa. The weapon, dismissed by some modern historians as obsolete, proved effective for years precisely because tanks like the Panzer II had been so thinly armoured. As long as light reconnaissance vehicles and armoured cars existed, the 37mm remained useful. By late 1939, Polish military intelligence in exile began compiling comprehensive reports on the September campaign for Allied use. These reports, based on accounts from survivors and analysis of German tactics, provided crucial insights into German armoured warfare. British and French officers studied the Polish experiences, learning about German operational methods, weaknesses in coordination, and the effectiveness of anti-tank defences. The French in particular noted that their own 25mm and 47mm anti-tank guns should be more than adequate against German armour if properly positioned and supported. This analysis was correct as far as it went. The problem was that by the time Germany attacked France in May 1940, tank armour had already been increased significantly, based on lessons from Poland. The Panzer II AOSF had thicker armour. The Panzer III and IV models were available in much greater numbers. The Germans had learned from their mistakes. The French had not learned quickly enough. The crew inside a Panzer II at Mokra experienced the battle very differently than commanders viewing it from a distance. The tank's interior was cramped, hot, and noisy. The commander sat in the small turret alongside the gunner, both men squeezed into a space less than 1 metre wide. The driver sat alone in the hull, forward of the turret, with limited visibility through a small vision port. When 37mm armour-piercing shells began hitting the tank column, crews had only seconds to react. The sound of a high-velocity round striking armour was distinctive and terrifying. If the shell penetrated, the crew compartment became a death trap. Fragments of armour spalling off the inside of the hull travelled at supersonic speeds, tearing through flesh and shattering bones. If the fuel tank was hit, fire erupted instantly, and the crew had perhaps 10 seconds to escape before the flames became unsurvivable. If ammunition detonated, the crew died without warning. Tankers who survived learned to identify the sound of different anti-tank weapons by the pitch of their shells and the pattern of hits. They learned which parts of their vehicle were most vulnerable. They learned, most importantly, to fear and respect enemy anti-tank capabilities. The psychological impact of these first encounters extended throughout the German army. Infantry who had expected tanks to break through Polish defences and make their job easy, instead found themselves fighting without adequate armoured support. Artillery observers who had planned fire missions based on rapid advances instead had to improvise as attacks stalled. Supply units that had expected to move forward behind fast-moving spearheads instead found themselves dealing with higher than anticipated casualties and equipment losses. The entire German military machine, which had practiced and refined blitzkrieg doctrine in the years since Hitler came to power, discovered that doctrine alone couldn't compensate for material deficiencies. Tanks needed adequate armour to survive on modern battlefields. This was not a new insight, but Poland provided the bloody proof. The historical narrative of World War II tends to emphasize German military prowess, particularly in the early campaigns when Germany appeared unstoppable. But a closer examination of the Polish campaign reveals a more complex picture. Yes, Germany won. Yes, Poland was defeated in just over a month. But the cost was far higher than anticipated, the resistance far more effective than expected, and the lessons far more sobering than propaganda suggested. At Mokra, at Pultusk, at Warsaw, and at dozens of smaller engagements, Polish forces demonstrated that with proper equipment, training and leadership, they could not just resist but defeat German attacks. The tragedy for Poland was that individual tactical victories couldn't overcome strategic impossibility. Surrounded by enemies, abandoned by allies who failed to launch, promised offensives, and ultimately betrayed by the Soviet invasion from the east, Poland fought alone and fell. But Polish soldiers had nothing to be ashamed of. The 37mm Bofors gun that destroyed so many German tanks at Mokra was a weapon ahead of its time in 1939, and by 1941 it was becoming obsolete as tank armour thickness increased. But for a brief window, from the mid-1930s to the early 1940s, it represented the state-of-the-art in anti-tank weaponry. Light, enough to be towed by a truck or even a team of horses, powerful enough to defeat contemporary armour at effective combat ranges, reliable and accurate, it was exactly the weapon Poland needed. The fact that Poland had 1,200 of them demonstrated that Polish military planning had been serious and professional. Polish commanders knew war with Germany was coming. They prepared as well as their limited industrial base and budget allowed. When war came, their weapons worked. The question for historians is not why Poland lost, but rather why Polish resistance was so effective despite impossible odds. Part of the answer lies in weapons like the Bofors gun, and men trained to use them effectively. The specific engagement at Mokra on September 1st became the subject of immediate German investigation. 4th Panzer Division staff officers compiled detailed reports examining what went wrong. They identified several contributing factors. First, reconnaissance had been inadequate. The division advanced without proper intelligence on Polish defensive positions, particularly anti-tank gun emplacements. Second, the terrain favoured defenders. The wooded hills and scattered villages provided excellent cover for hidden guns. Third, combined arms coordination was poor. Tanks advanced without adequate infantry support to suppress anti-tank weapons. Artillery preparation was insufficient. Fourth, the Panzer II itself was revealed as inadequate for direct assault against prepared positions. Its armour was too thin and its gun too weak. The report concluded that future operations would require better reconnaissance, more careful terrain analysis, stronger artillery preparation, tighter infantry armour coordination, and ultimately better tanks. These were all correct conclusions, and German forces improved in all these areas during subsequent campaigns. But the fundamental lesson, that tanks were vulnerable to anti-tank weapons, could not be erased. The Polish gunner who destroyed the 1st Panzer II at Mokra, whose name has been lost to history, probably didn't realise the significance of his shot. He was following his training, engaging an enemy target at the range his instructors had specified, using the sight picture he had practiced hundreds of times. He pulled the trigger, the gun roared. The armour-piercing shell crossed the distance to the target in a fraction of a second. Steel penetrated steel. The German tank stopped, smoke pouring from hatches as the crew tried desperately to escape. For that Polish gunner, it was the first time his training had translated into actual combat success. For the German tank crew, if they survived, it was the moment they learned their vehicle was not the invincible weapon they had been promised. For military historians studying the engagement decades later, it represented the beginning of an evolutionary race between armour and anti-tank weapons that would define armoured warfare for the rest of the 20th century and beyond. In the end, the story of the Panzer II facing Polish anti-tank guns in September 1939 is a story about the gap between theory and reality, between what generals plan and what soldiers experience, between propaganda and truth. German propaganda told the world that Poland had fallen easily to superior German might, that Polish forces had been obsolete and poorly trained, that the campaign had been a demonstration of modern military efficiency. The reality, visible in casualty reports and destroyed vehicles scattered across Polish battlefields, was far different. Poland fought hard and fought well. Polish soldiers proved that German armour was vulnerable, that German tactics were flawed, that the Wehrmacht was not invincible. These lessons, bought with Polish blood and Polish sacrifice, would serve the Allies well in years to come. Every British, American, French and Soviet anti-tank gunner who studied tactics in the years after Poland fell benefited from Polish experience. Every Allied commander who positioned anti-tank weapons to ambush German armour was applying lessons learned at Mokra and similar engagements. The Polish soldiers who fought and died in September 1939 did not die in vain. They helped teach the world how to defeat Nazi Germany. The Panzer II, designed as a stopgap and thrust into combat because nothing better was available in sufficient numbers, paid the price for Germany's rushed rearmament. If German commanders had waited, if they had built up larger stocks of Panzer III and IV tanks before launching the invasion, Polish anti-tank guns would have been far less effective. But Hitler's impatience and political considerations forced the Wehrmacht to attack before they were truly ready. The result was a victory that cost far more than anticipated, took longer than planned, and exposed weaknesses that would plague German forces throughout the war. The Panzer II's experience in Poland became a cautionary tale within German armoured forces. Old veterans would tell new crews about Mokra, about how tanks could be destroyed by properly positioned anti-tank guns, about how armour and gun were worthless without proper tactics and support. These oral traditions, passing from one generation of tankers to the next, kept the memory of Poland alive even as propaganda tried to minimise the campaign's difficulties. Today, when historians study the opening of World War II, Mokra deserves more attention than it typically receives. It was not a strategic victory for Poland. The battle didn't change the war's outcome, but it was a tactical success that demonstrated Polish military competence and German vulnerability. It showed that small nations with limited resources could still acquire effective modern weapons and train soldiers to use them successfully. It proved that propaganda and political theatre, which the Nazis excelled at, could not substitute for adequate equipment and realistic planning. Most importantly for the broader history of the war, Mokra and similar engagements forced German military reforms that improved their forces for subsequent campaigns. The Wehrmacht that invaded France in May 1940 was better than the Wehrmacht that invaded Poland in September 1939, in large part because Polish resistance had exposed German weaknesses. This is Polish contribution to eventual Allied victory, often overlooked but historically significant. The men who manned anti-tank guns at Mokra, who destroyed those first Panzer IIs, who held their positions even as their situation became hopeless, deserves to be remembered not as victims, but as soldiers who fought effectively against tremendous odds. The day the Panzer II faced its first real anti-tank guns, September 1st, 1939, at Mokra, Poland, marked a turning point not just in that campaign, but in the broader evolution of armoured warfare. The outcome shocked German commanders, not because they lost the battle ultimately, they captured Mokra on September 3rd, but because the battle was so much harder than anticipated. Those destroyed Panzer IIs, those casualties among German tank crews, those hours of delay as German attacks stalled against Polish defences, all of this contradicted the narrative of easy German victory. The truth was that Poland fought well with what they had. The tragedy was that what they had wasn't enough to win against the combined might of Nazi Germany and eventually Soviet Russia. But on that first day at Mokra, Polish anti-tank gunners proved something important. They proved that resistance was possible, that German armour could be defeated, that courage and skill and proper weapons could stop the Nazi war machine, at least for a day. That was the lesson of Mokra, and it resonates through history. The tactical lessons from Mokra spread rapidly through Polish defensive positions during the first week of September. At the Battle of Jordanov on September 1st through 3rd, Polish forces armed with the same 37mm Bofors guns destroyed 11 German tanks, including multiple Panzer IIs. The 21st Mountain Infantry Division, defending mountain passes in southern Poland, discovered that narrow defiles and forested terrain multiplied the effectiveness of anti-tank weapons. German tanks, unable to manoeuvre off narrow roads without risking mobilization in rough terrain, were forced to advance in column formation, where each vehicle blocked the retreat of those behind it. Polish gunners positioned on high ground could fire down onto the thin top armour of German tanks, typically just 10mm thick on the Panzer II. At ranges under 200 metres, Polish armour-piercing rounds punched through this protection with ease, killing crews and destroying engines. German after-action reports from Jordanov noted with frustration that terrain and skilled defensive positioning had neutralised German numerical superiority in armour. The Battle of Mwawa, which began on September 1st and continued through September 3rd, provided another demonstration of Polish anti-tank effectiveness. The 3rd Panzer Division, advancing from East Prussia toward Warsaw, encountered the heavily fortified Mwawa defensive line. Polish engineers had spent years preparing these positions, creating interlocking fields of fire for anti-tank guns and pre-sighting ranges to ensure accuracy. When German tanks approached, they faced not just 37mm Bofors guns but also Polish artillery firing over open sights at armoured targets. The combination proved devastating. German tanks were forced to withdraw after losing dozens of vehicles in the first hours of combat. General Walter von Brauchitsch, Commander-in-Chief of the German Army, personally visited the Mwawa sector on September 2nd to assess why the advance had stalled. His report to Hitler emphasised that Polish defensive preparations were far more sophisticated than intelligence had indicated, and that Polish anti-tank capabilities posed a serious threat to German armour. The engagement at Wisna, though it occurred later in the campaign from September 7th through 10th, exemplified the effectiveness of properly employed Polish anti-tank weapons. Captain Władysław Raginis commanded just 720 Polish soldiers defending a narrow crossing of the Narew River against the German Third Army's 42,000 men supported by tanks and aircraft. Polish defenders had positioned their anti-tank guns to cover all approaches to the crossing. For 3 days, German forces attempted to break through, losing multiple tanks to Polish fire. The Panzer II proved particularly vulnerable in the marshy terrain around the river, where vehicles that strayed from roads became bogged down and presented stationary targets. Polish gunners destroyed German tanks systematically, with one gun crew claiming 5 confirmed kills before their position was finally overrun. The Battle of Wisna demonstrated that even vastly outnumbered Polish forces could hold positions indefinitely if terrain favoured the defence and anti-tank weapons were properly positioned. German tactical adaptations to Polish anti-tank effectiveness became visible by the campaign's second week. Tank units began advancing only after extensive artillery preparation designed to suppress or destroy anti-tank gun positions. The Luftwaffe received priority requests to attack identified anti-tank emplacements with dive bombers. German infantry was pushed forward to screen for anti-tank guns before tanks committed to the attack. Smoke shells were used extensively to obscure Polish gunners' vision and prevent accurate fire. These adaptations were effective but time-consuming and resource-intensive. The rapid advances German planners had anticipated were replaced by methodical combined arms operations that prioritised force protection over speed. The blitzkrieg concept, which depended on armoured spearheads penetrating deep into enemy territory before defenders could react, was being modified in real time based on the harsh realities of combat against an enemy with effective anti-tank capabilities. The vulnerability of the Panzer II's thin armour was not news to German tank designers. Alexander von Falkenhausen, who had overseen development of early German tank models, had warned repeatedly that 14 to 30 millimeters of armour would be inadequate against modern anti-tank weapons. But Germany's rearmament program in the mid-1930s had prioritised quantity over quality. The Treaty of Versailles had forbidden Germany from possessing tanks, so when Hitler repudiated the treaty in 1935, German industry had to build an armoured force from nothing. The Panzer II was never intended as Germany's primary battle tank. It was designed as a training vehicle that could be pressed into combat if necessary, while better tanks were developed. But development of the Panzer III and IV took longer than anticipated, and production numbers remained low through 1938 and 1939. When war came, Germany had no choice but to rely heavily on the Panzer II, despite its known vulnerabilities. Polish anti-tank gunners were simply exploiting weaknesses that German designers already knew existed. The human cost of these early tank battles was staggering for both sides. German tank crews who survived the destruction of their vehicles often suffered terrible injuries. When an armour-piercing shell penetrated a Panzer II's thin plate, the shell itself and fragments of armour spalling from the interior travelled through the crew compartment at lethal velocities. The confined space meant there was nowhere to hide, no cover available. Crews described the experience as being inside a bell when it was struck by a hammer. The sound was deafening, disorienting. If you survived the initial penetration, you had seconds to escape before fire or secondary ammunition detonations killed you. Many German tankers suffered burns that left them disfigured for life. Others lost limbs or eyes to shell fragments. The tank crews who fought in Poland and survived often requested transfers to other units, any unit, as long as it didn't involve climbing back into a thinly armoured vehicle. Polish anti-tank gun crews faced their own horrors. The 37mm Bofors, while effective, required its crew to remain exposed during firing. The gun had a small shield that protected the gunner and loader from small arms fire and shell fragments, but this shield was useless against German tank cannons or artillery. When German tanks or artillery spotted a Polish anti-tank position, the response was immediate and overwhelming. 20mm autocannon fire from Panzer IIs, 75mm high explosive shells from Panzer IVs, or concentrated artillery fire would saturate the area. Polish gun crews took terrible casualties. At Mokra, the Wawinska Cavalry Brigade lost 11 of its 14 anti-tank guns destroyed during the battle. Most of the crews died at their weapons, continuing to fire even as German tanks or artillery targeted them. The survivors described the experience as operating in a nightmare where you could destroy enemy vehicles but knew that each shot revealed your position and invited overwhelming retaliation. The Battle of Tomaszów-Lubelski, fought from September the 17th through 20th, provided a final demonstration of Polish anti-tank effectiveness even as the strategic situation collapsed. Surrounded by German forces and with the Soviet invasion eliminating any hope of relief, Polish forces, including elements of the Krakow army, continued fighting. Polish 37mm guns destroyed numerous German tanks during repeated breakout attempts. Even with fuel and ammunition running critically low, Polish gunners maintained disciplined fire control, engaging German armour at optimal ranges and achieving high hit rates. German commanders expressed frustration in radio intercepts captured by Polish intelligence that despite overwhelming superiority, they continued to suffer tank losses to Polish anti-tank fire. When Polish forces finally surrendered on September 20th, German officers inspecting captured Polish positions found anti-tank gun emplacements that had been expertly positioned with clear fields of fire and prepared alternate positions. The professionalism of Polish defensive preparations impressed even hardened German veterans. The fate of Polish anti-tank gunners after capture varied widely. Some were treated as prisoners of war and spent years in German POW camps. Others, particularly those who had inflicted heavy German casualties, were executed in violation of the Geneva Conventions. The Germans, frustrated by Polish resistance and bitter about their own casualties, sometimes took revenge on captured Polish soldiers. Polish anti-tank crews were particular targets because German tankers knew these were the men who had destroyed their comrades. At several locations, Polish prisoners who were identified as anti-tank gunners were separated from other POWs and shot. These war crimes, documented in post-war investigations, reflected German anger at how effective Polish resistance had been. The myth of easy victory required that Polish military effectiveness be denied or minimized. Captured Polish soldiers who had demonstrated that effectiveness became inconvenient evidence that the myth was false. The statistical analysis of German tank losses in Poland reveals patterns that German commanders found disturbing. Of the 819 German tanks lost during the campaign, analysis of damage reports shows that approximately 60% were destroyed or disabled by anti-tank guns, rather than by tank versus tank combat, artillery, or air attack. This was shocking because German doctrine assumed that tanks would primarily be threatened by enemy tanks. The revelation that towed anti-tank guns operated by infantry were the primary threat forced doctrinal revisions. German armoured doctrine after Poland emphasised the critical importance of suppressing anti-tank weapons before committing tanks to attack. This represented a fundamental shift from the pre-war doctrine that had envisioned tanks operating relatively independently, using speed and shock to overwhelm defences. Polish anti-tank gunners had taught the Wehrmacht that modern defences could not be simply overrun. The Panzer II continued in production until 1942, with various improved models attempting to address the vulnerabilities exposed in Poland. The Auerseff F variant featured 35mm of frontal armour and improved engine cooling. The Auerseff G moved the engine to the rear of the hull in an attempt to improve armour distribution. The Ausf-J featured 80mm of frontal armour, though only 22 of these heavily armoured variants were produced. But even these improvements were recognised as inadequate. By 1940, German tank production was shifting decisively toward the Panzer III and IV models, which offered 50mm or more of frontal armour and more powerful guns. The Panzer II was increasingly relegated to reconnaissance roles where its speed and mechanical reliability were valuable, and where its thin armour was less likely to be tested against prepared anti-tank defences. By 1943, most Panzer IIs had been withdrawn from frontline combat units and were serving in training roles or had been converted to other uses such as self-propelled artillery or ammunition carriers. The 37mm Bofors gun that had proven so effective in Poland continued to evolve as well. The Germans, recognising its effectiveness, not only pressed captured Polish guns into service, but also studied the design extensively. German anti-tank gun development was influenced by lessons learned from the Bofors, particularly its balance between penetration power, weight, and ease of concealment. The later German 50mm Pak-38 anti-tank gun incorporated design elements clearly influenced by the Bofors. British, French, American, and Soviet anti-tank gun designers also studied the Bofors carefully. The weapons combat record in Poland provided valuable data about what characteristics were most important in anti-tank gun design. High muzzle velocity for armour penetration, low silhouette for concealment, lightweight for mobility, and reliable mechanical operation all became standard requirements for anti-tank weapons in all armies. The Bofors had demonstrated what was possible, and every army wanted similar capabilities. Polish military performance in September 1939 has been systematically underestimated in popular history, partly because of effective German propaganda, and partly because military historians naturally focus on winners rather than losers. But detailed examination of specific engagements reveals that Polish forces were neither obsolete nor incompetent. At Mokra, Polish cavalry armed with modern weapons stopped a German panzer division. At Wisna, 700 Poles held off 42,000 Germans for 3 days. At Warsaw, Polish forces held out for 3 weeks under siege, inflicting heavy casualties on German attackers. Throughout the campaign, Polish anti-tank gunners destroyed German armour at rates that shocked German commanders. The problem was never Polish fighting ability or equipment quality. The problem was the strategic impossibility of Poland's situation, surrounded by enemies and abandoned by allies who had promised support but failed to deliver. The experience of individual Polish soldiers who fought these battles and survived provides the most powerful testimony to what happened in September 1939. Jerzy Poręba, who served as a gunner on a 37mm Bofors at Mokra, recalled in a post-war memoir that his crew destroyed 3 German tanks on September 1st before their position was overrun. He described the almost mechanical nature of the engagement once firing began. Identify target, calculate range, adjust sight, load, fire, observe impact, reload. The training had been so thorough that these actions became automatic even under the stress of combat. He remembered the faces of German tankers fleeing from burning vehicles, their terror visible even at several hundred meters distance. He remembered thinking that these supposedly invincible German soldiers were just as afraid as he was, just as vulnerable. After the war, Poręba emigrated to Britain and spent decades trying to tell anyone who would listen that Polish soldiers had fought well and bravely, that they had not simply surrendered without resistance as propaganda suggested. Few people believed him, until military historians began seriously examining Polish military records in the 1960s and 1970s. The technological race between armour and anti-tank weapons that intensified after Poland continued throughout World War II and beyond. Each increase in armour thickness prompted development of more powerful anti-tank guns. Each improvement in anti-tank gun penetration forced tank designers to add more armour. The Panzer II, with its 14 to 30mm of protection, represented one early point in this evolutionary race. Within 2 years, German tanks would carry 100mm of frontal armour. By war's end, some German tanks featured 180mm of armour. Anti-tank guns evolved from 37mm to 50, 75, 88, and eventually 128mm. The cycle of measure and countermeasure continues to this day, with modern tanks carrying composite armour arrays and reactive armour, while anti-tank guided missiles feature shaped charge warheads capable of penetrating hundreds of millimetres of steel. All of this technological competition traces its origins to those early battles where defenders discovered they could defeat armoured vehicles with the right weapons and tactics. German lessons from Poland influenced the entire course of armoured warfare during World War II. The realisation that tanks needed thicker armour led to the development of the Panther and Tiger tanks, which featured protection levels unimaginable in 1939. The understanding that combined arms cooperation was essential for armoured success led to improved doctrine for coordinating tanks, infantry, artillery and air support. The recognition that reconnaissance and intelligence were critical for preventing ambushes by anti-tank weapons led to better scouting procedures and more extensive use of aerial reconnaissance. All of these improvements made German armoured forces more formidable in subsequent campaigns, but they also made German armoured forces more expensive, more complex and more difficult to produce in the quantities needed. The Panzer II had been cheap and simple to manufacture, with production rates exceeding 100 per month at peak. The Tiger tank, by contrast, was produced at a rate of less than 100 per month at its production peak, and cost 10 times as much. Poland taught Germany that quality mattered, but the lesson came with a price. The Polish government in exile, established in France after Poland's defeat, and later relocated to London, compiled extensive reports on the September campaign for Allied use. These reports included detailed tactical analyses of successful anti-tank engagements, emphasizing the importance of proper positioning, camouflage, fire discipline, and crew training. British and French officers found these reports invaluable for planning their own anti-tank defences. The British Home Guard, preparing to resist a possible German invasion in 1940 and 1941, studied Polish tactics extensively and incorporated Polish lessons into their training. The effectiveness of small anti-tank guns in ambush positions became a central element of British defensive planning. While Britain was never invaded and these plans were never tested in combat, the influence of Polish experience on British thinking was significant. Polish officers serving with Allied forces brought their combat experience with them, and their expertise was actively sought by British and American units preparing for combat against German armour. The Soviet invasion of Poland from the east on September 17th eliminated any possibility of Polish strategic success, but even against Soviet forces, Polish anti-tank weapons proved effective. At the Battle of Grodno, Polish forces, including anti-tank units, engaged Soviet armour, destroying multiple tanks before being overwhelmed. Soviet tanks in 1939, including the BT-7 and T-26 models, had armour protection similar to or even thinner than German tanks. The 37mm Bofors was equally effective against Soviet armour. Polish anti-tank gunners discovered that Soviet tank tactics were less sophisticated than German methods, with Soviet tanks often advancing in close formations without adequate infantry support. This made them vulnerable to well-positioned anti-tank guns. But as with the German invasion, individual tactical successes couldn't overcome strategic impossibility. Poland was fighting two massive enemies simultaneously, and no amount of tactical skill could compensate for that disadvantage. The memory of September 1939 remained central to Polish national identity throughout the Cold War and beyond. For Poles living under communist rule imposed by the Soviet Union, the memory that Poland had fought bravely and effectively against impossible odds provided a measure of pride in dark times. Veterans of the September campaign, those who survived and remained in Poland, generally stayed silent about their experiences during the communist period. The Soviet Union, which had been Germany's ally during the invasion through the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, did not want attention drawn to its role in Poland's defeat. But in private, among families and trusted friends, the stories circulated. Stories of destroying German tanks at Mokra, of holding impossible positions at Wisna, of fighting to the last round at Warsaw. These memories sustained Polish national identity through decades of occupation and repression. The technical specifications of the Panzer II and the 37mm Bofors tell only part of the story. On paper, the engagement seems almost predetermined. A gun that can penetrate 40mm of armour at 300 metres will obviously defeat a tank with 14 to 30mm of protection. But between the technical specifications and the actual combat outcome lies the human element. Crews had to position guns effectively, had to maintain discipline under fire, had to acquire targets and engage accurately while German tanks were shooting back, while German artillery was targeting their positions, while German aircraft were bombing and strafing. The Polish anti-tank gunners who accomplished this demonstrated not just technical proficiency, but extraordinary courage. They stood their ground when every instinct screamed to run, when common sense said that men with small-towed guns could not possibly defeat tanks and live. Many of them didn't live, but they fought effectively, and their effectiveness changed how the world understood armoured warfare. The Panzer II's combat career after Poland followed a trajectory of gradual obsolescence. In France in 1940, Panzer IIs still formed a significant portion of German armoured strength, but French anti-tank guns and British defensive positions took a heavy toll. The 47mm French anti-tank gun could penetrate Panzer II armour at ranges exceeding 1,000 metres. British 2-pounder anti-tank guns were similarly effective. German tank losses in France were lighter than in Poland, but this reflected more careful German tactics and overwhelming Luftwaffe support rather than any improvement in the Panzer II's survivability. In the Balkans campaigns of 1941, Panzer II saw action against Yugoslav and Greek forces, where they faced limited anti-tank opposition and performed adequately in reconnaissance and infantry support roles. But the limitations exposed in Poland were never overcome. Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union beginning in June 1941, marked the Panzer II's final significant combat deployment. Soviet forces possessed vast numbers of anti-tank guns, including 45mm and 57mm weapons that could easily defeat Panzer II armour. Soviet tanks, including the T-34 and KV-1 models that appeared in combat, shocked German forces with their thick armour and powerful guns. The Panzer II's 20mm autocannon could not penetrate Soviet medium or heavy tank armour even at point-blank range, while Soviet tank guns could destroy Panzer IIs at any range. German tankers in Panzer IIs facing Soviet armour described feeling helpless, unable to retreat fast enough to escape and unable to fight effectively. Panzer II units suffered catastrophic losses in the early months of Barbarossa. By late 1941, most surviving Panzer IIs had been withdrawn from frontline service. The lessons of Poland about inadequate armour and insufficient firepower had been relearned at far higher cost on the Eastern Front. The ultimate judgment on the Panzer II must acknowledge both its successes and failures. As a training vehicle and stopgap measure, it served its purpose adequately. It gave German tankers experience with tracked armoured vehicles before better tanks became available. It provided mobile firepower for infantry support in situations where opposition was light. In reconnaissance roles, where speed and mechanical reliability mattered more than armour protection, it performed well. But as a main battle tank expected to face serious opposition, it was inadequate from the moment it entered combat. Polish anti-tank gunners at Mokra and elsewhere demonstrated this inadequacy clearly and repeatedly. The fact that German forces eventually overran Polish positions and won the campaign did not change the fundamental reality that the Panzer II was too lightly armoured and too weakly armed to succeed against competent opposition with modern weapons. The broader historical significance of these early encounters between German armour and Polish anti-tank weapons extends far beyond the immediate tactical outcomes. September 1939 established patterns that would repeat throughout World War II. Armoured vehicles, despite their psychological impact and mobility advantages, were vulnerable to properly employed anti-tank weapons. Infantry armed with effective anti-tank capabilities could stop or slow armoured attacks, buying time for reinforcements or retreats. Terrain, positioning, and tactical skill could compensate partly for numerical inferiority. These lessons, learned by Polish soldiers in desperate defensive battles, were eventually applied by Allied forces across Europe and ultimately contributed to Germany's defeat. Every British, American, and Soviet anti-tank gunner who successfully engaged German armour was applying principles that Polish gunners had demonstrated in September 1939. The commemoration of these battles in post-war Poland and in Polish diaspora communities worldwide reflects their continued importance to Polish national consciousness. Mokra, in particular, has been extensively memorialised. A museum at the battlefield preserves artefacts and documents from the engagement. Monuments honour the soldiers who fought there. September 1st, the anniversary of the battle and of the war's beginning, is observed annually. These commemorations serve multiple purposes. They honour the soldiers who fought and died. They preserve historical memory of Polish military effectiveness against propaganda claims of easy German victory. They provide evidence that Poland resisted forcefully and that Polish soldiers performed with skill and courage. For a nation that suffered terribly during World War II, losing 6 million citizens and experiencing 6 years of brutal occupation, these memories of effective military resistance provide important historical validation. The German perspective on these early battles evolved over time. During the war, propaganda necessity required minimizing Polish effectiveness and emphasizing German superiority. After the war, as German veterans wrote memoirs and historians compiled official histories, more honest assessments emerged. Former German officers acknowledged that Polish resistance had been more effective than expected, that Polish anti-tank capabilities had shocked German commanders, and that lessons learned in Poland had influenced German tactics throughout the war. Some German veterans expressed respect for their Polish opponents, acknowledging the courage and skill of Polish soldiers. These post-war acknowledgements, while sometimes grudging, represented a significant shift from wartime propaganda. They confirmed what Polish veterans had always known, that Polish forces had fought effectively, and that German victory had been far more difficult than the world had been told. The technological legacy of these battles influenced military development worldwide. The demonstration that relatively small-caliber anti-tank guns could defeat contemporary armour prompted every military to invest in anti-tank weapons development. By 1942, every major army fielded anti-tank guns in the 50 to 75mm range, vastly more powerful than the 37mm weapons of 1939. Tank designers responded by increasing armour thickness, leading to the heavy tanks of 1943 to 1945. This evolutionary race continued into the Cold War era, with tanks growing ever heavier and anti-tank weapons growing ever more powerful. Modern main battle tanks weighing 60 to 70 tons, with composite armour arrays descend in a direct line from the arms race that began when Polish 37mm guns demonstrated they could defeat 14 to 30mm armour. The technological sophistication of contemporary armoured warfare traces its origins to those desperate September days in 1939 when Polish gunners proved that tanks could be killed. In conclusion, the day the Panzer II faced its first real anti-tank guns at Mokra and across Polish battlefields in September 1939 represented a defining moment in the history of armoured warfare. The outcome shocked German commanders because it contradicted their assumptions about tank invulnerability and Polish military capabilities. It forced immediate tactical and technological adaptations that influenced German military development throughout World War II. It demonstrated principles of anti-tank warfare that Allied forces would later employ successfully against German armour. It provided evidence that Polish military forces were professional, well-equipped, and capable of inflicting serious losses on a supposedly superior enemy. Most importantly for understanding the broader war, it established that courage, skill, and proper weapons could defeat even the most modern military forces, at least temporarily. Polish soldiers who manned anti-tank guns in September 1939 wrote a chapter of military history that deserves far more recognition than it typically receives. They faced impossible odds with inadequate numbers and no hope of strategic victory. They fought anyway, and they fought effectively. The destroyed Panzer II's littering Polish battlefields testified to their skill. The German casualties and tactical adaptations testified to their effectiveness. The continued Polish resistance through 6 years of occupation and the eventual Allied victory testified to the enduring importance of their sacrifice. The thunder of 37mm Bofors guns at Mokra echoed through the entire war, reminding everyone who heard it that resistance was possible, that tyranny could be opposed, and that even in defeat soldiers could demonstrate courage and competence that history would eventually recognize and honor.